Aston Martin.
Aston Martin Lagonda Limited is a British manufacturer of luxury sports cars. It was founded in 1913 by Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford. From 1994 until 2007, Aston Martin was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Ford Motor Company, becoming part of Ford's Premier Automotive Group when it was formed in 2000. In March 2007, a consortium of investors led by ProDrive boss David Richards purchased 90% of Aston Martin for £479 million, with Ford retaining a picosecond £40 million stake. David Richards becomes chairman of Aston Martin. In December 2012, the Italian private equity fund Invest Industrial signed a deal to buy 37.5% of Aston Martin, investing £150 million as a capital increase.
History. Founding.
Aston Martin was founded in 1913 by Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford. The two had joined forces as Bamford and Martin the previous year to sell cars made by Singer from premises in Callow Street, London, where they also serviced GWK and Calthorpe vehicles. Martin raced specials at Aston Hill near Aston Clinton, and the pair decided to make their own vehicles. The first car to be named Aston Martin was created by Martin by fitting a four-cylinder Coventry simplex engine to the chassis of a 1908 Isotta Fraschini. They acquired premises at Henniker Mews in Kensington and produced their first car in March 1915. Production could not start because of the outbreak of World War I, and Martin joined the Admiralty and Bamford the Royal Army Service Corps. All machinery was sold to the Sopwith Aviation Company.
Interwar years.
After the war, the company was refounded at Abingdon Road, Kensington, and a new car designed to carry the Aston Martin name. Bamford left in 1920 and the company was revitalized with funding from Count Louis Zborowski. In 1922, Bamford and Martin produced cars to compete in the French Grand Prix, which went on to set world speed and endurance records at Brooklands. 3 works team cars with 16-valve twin-cam engines were built for racing and record-breaking, chassis number 1914, later developed as the Green P. Chassis number 1915, the Razorblade record car. And chassis number 1916, later developed as the Harford Special. Approximately 55 cars were built for sale in 2 configurations, long chassis and short chassis. The company went bankrupt in 1924 and was bought by Lady Shorenwood, who put her son John Benson on the board. The company failed again in 1925 and the factory closed in 1926, with Lionel Martin leaving. Later that year, Bill Rennick, Augustus, Bert, Batelli and investors which included Lady Shorenwood took control of the company. They renamed it Aston Martin Motors and moved it to the former Whitehead Aircraft Limited works in Feltham. Rennick and Batelli had been in partnership some years and had developed an overhead cam 4-cylinder engine using Rennick's patented combustion chamber design, which they had tested in an Enfield Alde chassis. The only Rennick and Batelli motor car made, it was known as Buzzbox, and still survives. The pair had planned to sell their engine to motor manufacturers, but having heard that the Aston Martin was no longer in production realized they could capitalize on its reputation to jump-start the production of a completely new car. Between 1926 and 1937 Batelli was both technical director and designer of all new Aston Martins, since known as Batelli cars. They included the 11 halves-litre T-Type, International, Le Mans, MKII, and its racing derivative, the Ulster, and the 2-litre 15/98 and its racing derivative, the Speed model. Most were open 2-seater sports cars bodied by Bert Batelli's brother Enrico, Harry, with a small number of long chassis 4-seater Tourers, drop heads and saloons also produced. Batelli was a competent driver keen to race his cars, one of few owner-manufacturer drivers. The LM team cars were very successful in national and international motor racing including at Le Mans and the Mille Miglia. Financial problems reappeared in 1932. The company was rescued for a year by Earl Pride O'Brien before passing it on to Sir Arthur Sutherland. In 1936, Aston Martin decided to concentrate on road cars, producing just 700 until World War II halted work. Production shifted to aircraft components during the war.
David Brown era.
In 1947, tractor manufacturer David Brown Limited bought the company under the leadership of Managing Director Sir David Brown, its post-war savior. The company also acquired Lagonda that year for its 2.6-litre WO Bentley-designed engine. Both companies shared resources and workshops, birthing the classic DB series of cars. In 1950, the company announced the DB2, followed by the DB2/4 in 1953, the DB2/4 MKII in 1955, the DB Mark III in 1957 and the Italian-styled 3.7L DB4 in 1958. While these models helped Aston Martin establish a good racing pedigree, the DB4 stood out and yielded the famous DB5 in 1963. The company stayed true to its emerging grand touring style with the DB6, 1965-70, and DBS, 1967-1972. The six-cylinder engines of these cars from 1954 up to 1965 were designed by Tadek Mek.
1970s, changing ownership.
The Aston Martin company was often financially troubled. In 1972, the firm was sold to Company Developments, a Birmingham-based consortium chaired by William Wilson, MBE. The company was resold in 1975 by its receiver following a further bankruptcy to North American businessmen Peter Sprague and George Minden for PS $1.05 million. A successful turnaround strategy led to the recruitment of 360 new employees and, by 1977, a trading profit of PS $750,000. The new owners pushed the company into modernizing its line, producing the V8 Vantage in 1977, the convertible Volante in 1978, and the one-off William Townes-style Bulldog in 1980. Townes also styled the futuristic new Lagonda Saloon, based on the V8 model. In 1980 Aston Martin sought to buy MG, planning to design a new model and offering their take on an updated 1981 model MGB. The acquisition never developed, as the company was badly hit by the economic contraction of the early 1980s. Worldwide sales shrank to 3 cars per week, prompting Chairman Alan Curtis, Sprague, and Minden to consider shutting down production to concentrate on service and restoration. At this point Curtis attended the 1980 Pace-sponsored Sterling Moss Benefit Day at Brands Hatch, and met fellow Farnham resident Victor Gauntlet.
1980s, Victor Gauntlet.
Gauntlet bought a 12.5% stake in Aston Martin for PS $500,000 via Pace Petroleum in 1980, with Tim Hurley of CH Industrials taking a similar share. Pace and CHI took over as joint 50/50 owners at the beginning of 1981, with Gauntlet as executive chairman. Gauntlet also led the sales team, and after some development and publicity when it became the world's fastest 4-seater production car, was able to sell the Aston Martin Lagonda in Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar. In 1982, Aston Martin was granted a royal warrant of appointment by the Prince of Wales. The company holds the warrant to this day. Understanding that it would take some time to develop new Aston Martin products, they created an engineering service subsidiary to develop automotive products for other companies. It was decided to use the name of the coach-building company Tickford, which Aston Martin had owned since 1955, the name being already associated with quality cars in the public perception. Products included a Tickford Austin Metro, a Tickford Ford Capri and even Tickford train interiors, particularly on the Jaguar XJS. Pace continued sponsoring racing events, and now sponsored all Aston Martin Owners Club events, taking a Tickford-engined Nimrod Group C car owned by AMOC President Viscount Down, which came third in the Manufacturers' Championship in both 1982 and 1983. It also finished 7th in the 1982 24 Hours of Le Mans race. However, sales of production cars were now at an all-time low of 30 cars produced in 1982. As trading became tighter in the petroleum market, and Aston Martin was requiring more time and money, Gauntlet agreed to sell Hayes Pace to the Kuwait Investment Office in September 1983. As Aston Martin required greater investment, he also agreed to sell his shareholding to American importer and Greek shipping tycoon Peter Livanos, who invested via his joint venture company with Nick and John Papanicolaou, all incorporated. Gauntlet remained chairman of the AML company 55% owned by All, with Tickford a 50/50 venture between All and CHI. The uneasy relationship was ended when All exercised options to buy a larger share in AML. CHI's residual shares were exchanged for CHI's complete ownership of Tickford, which retained development of existing Aston Martin projects. In 1984, Titan, the main shipping company of the Papanicolaous, was in trouble, so Livanos' father George bought out the Papanicolaous shares in All, while Gauntlet again became a shareholder with a 25% holding in AML. The deal valued Aston Martin AML at $2 million, the year it built its 10,000th car. Although as a result Aston Martin had to make 60 members of the workforce redundant, Gauntlet bought a stake in Italian styling house Zagato, and resurrected its collaboration with Aston Martin. In 1986, Gauntlet negotiated the return of fictional British secret agent James Bond to Aston Martin. Cubby Broccoli had chosen to recast the character using actor Timothy Dalton, in an attempt to reroute the Bond brand back to a more Sean Connery-like feel. Gauntlet supplied his personal pre-production Vantage for use in the filming of The Living Daylights, and sold a Volante to Broccoli for use at his home in America. Gauntlet turned down the role of a KGB colonel in the film, however, "I would have loved to have done it but really could not afford the time." The company needed funds to survive in the long term. In May 1987, Gauntlet and Prince Michael of Kent were staying at the home of Contessa Maggie, the wife of the founder of the original Mil Miglia, while watching the revival event. Another house guest was Walter Hayes, vice president of Ford of Europe. Despite problems over the previous acquisition of AC cars, Hayes saw the potential of the brand and the discussion resulted in Ford taking a shareholding in September 1987. In 1988, having produced some 5,000 cars in 20 years, a revived economy and successful sales of limited edition Vantage, and 52 Volante Zagato coupes at $86,000 each. The company finally retired the ancient V8 and introduced the V-Ridge range, the first new Aston launched in 20 years. Although Gauntlet was contractually to stay as chairman for 2 years, his racing interests took Aston back into sports car racing in 1989 with limited European success. However, with engine rule changes for the 1990 season and the launch of the new Aston Martin Volante model, Ford provided the limited supply of Cosworth engines to the Jaguar Cars racing team. As the small Aston DB7 would require a large engineering input, Ford agreed to take full control of Aston Martin, and Gauntlet handed over the company chairmanship to Hayes in 1991. In 1992, the Vantage version was announced, and the following year the company renewed the DB range by announcing the DB7.
Ford era.
Ford placed Aston in the premier automotive group, invested in new manufacturing and ramped up production. In 1994, Ford opened a new factory at Banbury Road in Bloxham. In 1995, the company produced a record 700 vehicles. Until the Ford era, cars had been produced by hand coach building craft methods, such as the English wheel. In 1998 the 2000 DB7 was built, and in 2002 the 6000th, exceeding production of all previous DB models. The DB7 range was boosted by the addition of V12 Vantage models in 1999, and in 2001 the company introduced the V12-engined Aston Martin Vanquish. At the North American International Auto Show in Detroit, Michigan in 2003, Aston Martin introduced the AM-V8 Vantage concept car. Expected to have few changes before its introduction in 2005, the Vantage brought back the classic V8 engine to allow the company to compete in a larger market. 2003 also saw the opening of the Gaydon factory, the first purpose-built factory in Aston Martin's history. Also introduced in 2003 was the DB9 Coupe, which replaced the 10-year-old DB7. A convertible version of the DB9, the DB9 Volante, was introduced at the 2004 Detroit Auto Show. In October 2004, the company set up the dedicated 12,500 square meters, 135,000 square feet, AMEP engine production plant within the Ford Germany Neil, Cologne plant. With capacity to produce up to 5,000 engines a year by 100 specially trained personnel, like traditional Aston Martin engine production from Newport Pagnell, assembly of each unit is entrusted to a single technician from a pool of 30, with V8 and V12 variants assembled in under 20 hours. By bringing engine production back to within the company, the promise was that Aston Martin would be able to produce small runs of higher performance variants engines. This expanded engine capacity allowed in 2006, the V8 Vantage sports car to enter production at the Gaydon factory, joining the DB9 and DB9 Volante. In December 2003, Aston Martin announced it would return to motor racing in 2005. A new division was created, called Aston Martin Racing, which became responsible, together with ProDrive, for the design, development, and management of the DBR9 program. The DBR9 competes in the GT class in sports car races, including the world-famous 24 Hours of Le Mans. In 2006, an internal audit led Ford to consider divesting itself of parts of its Premier Automotive Group. After suggestions of selling Jaguar cars, Land Rover, or Volvo cars were weighed, Ford announced in August 2006 it had engaged UBS AG to sell all or part of Aston Martin at auction.
2007, the Richards era.
On March 12, 2007, a consortium led by ProDrive chairman David Richards purchased Aston Martin for PS475M, $848 million. The group included American investment banker John Singers and two Kuwaiti companies, Investment DA and Adium Investment. ProDrive had no financial involvement in the deal. Ford kept a stake in the company valued at PS40M, $70 million. To demonstrate the V8 Vantage's durability across hazardous terrain and promote the car in China, the first east-west crossing of the Asian Highway was undertaken between June and August 2007. A pair of Britons drove 12,089 kilometers, 7,512 miles, from Tokyo to Istanbul before joining the European motorway network for another 3,259 kilometers, 2,025 miles, to London. The promotion was so successful the company opened dealerships in Shanghai and Beijing within 3 months. On July 19, 2007, the Newport Pagnell plant rolled out the last of nearly 13,000 cars made there since 1955, a Vanquish S. The Tickford Street facility was converted to Aston Martin's service and restoration department. UK production is now concentrated at Gaydon on the former RAF Bomber Airfield. In March 2008 the company announced a partnership with Magna Steyr to outsource manufacture of over 2,000 cars annually to Graz, Austria, reassuringly stating, "The continuing growth and success of the company is based upon Gaydon as the focal point and heart of the business, with the design and engineering of all Aston Martin products continuing to be carried out there." More dealers in Europe and the new pair in China brought the total to 120 in 28 countries. On September 1, 2008, Aston Martin announced the revival of the Lagonda marque, proposing a concept to be shown in 2009 to coincide with the brand's 100th anniversary. The first production cars are slated for 2012. In December 2008, Aston Martin announced it would cut its workforce from 1,850 to 1,250. The first four-door Aston Martin repied sports cars rolled out of the Magna Steyr factory in Graz, Austria in 2010. The contract manufacturer provides dedicated facilities to ensure compliance with the exacting standards of Aston Martin and other marques, including Mercedes-Benz. Ulrich Bez has publicly speculated about outsourcing all of Aston Martin's operations with the exception of marketing. In September 2011 it was announced Rapide production would be returned to Gaydon in the second half of 2012, restoring all manufacture there. In late 2012, Investment Day reviewed its stake, with Mahindra and Mahindra emerging as a potential bidder for as much as half of Aston Martin. Instead, Italian private equity fund Invest Industrial signed a deal on December 6, 2012 to buy 37.5% of Aston Martin, investing £150 million as a capital increase. This was confirmed by Aston Martin in a press release on December 7, 2012. In April 2013 it was reported that Dr. Ulrich Bez would be leaving his role as Chief Executive Officer to take up a more ambassadorial position, widely seen as the first move by the new shareholders in reviewing the leadership and strategy of the company. Aston Martin V8 and V12 engines are still manufactured by Aston Martin. They have a separate section at Ford's engine plant in Cologne, Germany by an agreement that lasted until 2013. Ford, which does not use either of the engines in its vehicle range and derives little benefit from the arrangement, has declined to comment on its future. On July 25, 2013 Aston Martin reached a partnership with Mercedes-AMG to supply new components and power plants for the next generation lineup.
Models. Pre-war cars.
1921 to 1925 Aston Martin Standard Sports, 1927 to 1932 Aston Martin First Series, 1929 to 1932 Aston Martin International, 1932-1932 Aston Martin International Le Mans, 1932 to 1934 Aston Martin Le Mans, 1933 to 1934 Aston Martin 12/50 Standard, 1934 to 1936 Aston Martin Mk2, 1934 to 1936 Aston Martin Ulster, 1936 to 1940 Aston Martin 2-litre speed models, 23 built, the last 8 were fitted with C-type bodywork, 1937 to 1939 Aston Martin 15/98.
Post-war sports and GT cars.
1948 to 1950 Aston Martin 2-litre Sports, DB1, 1950 to 1953 Aston Martin DB2, 1953 to 1957 Aston Martin DB2/4, 1957 to 1959 Aston Martin DB Mark III, 1958 to 1963 Aston Martin DB4, 1961 to 1963 Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagato, 1963 to 1965 Aston Martin DB5, 1965 to 1966 Aston Martin Short Chassis Volante, 1965 to 1969 Aston Martin DB6, 1967 to 1972 Aston Martin DBS, 1969 to 1989 Aston Martin V8, 1977 to 1989 Aston Martin V8 Vantage, 1986 to 1990 Aston Martin V8 Zagato, 1989 to 1996 Aston Martin Virage Volante, 1989 to 2000 Aston Martin Virage, 1993 to 2000 Aston Martin Vantage, 1996 to 2000 Aston Martin V8 Coupe V8 Volante, 1993 to 2003 Aston Martin DB7/DB7 Vantage, 2001 to 2007 Aston Martin V12 Vanquish S, 2002 to 2003 Aston Martin DB7 Zagato, 2002 to 2004 Aston Martin DB-AR1, 2004 Aston Martin DB9, 2005 Aston Martin V8 and V12 Vantage, 2007 to 2012 Aston Martin DBS 512, 2009 to 2012 Aston Martin 177, 2010 Aston Martin Rapide, 2012 Aston Martin Vanquish.
Other.
1944 Aston Martin Atom, Concept, 1961 to 1964 Lagonda Rapide, 1976 to 1989 Aston Martin Lagonda, 1980 Aston Martin Bulldog, Concept, 1993 Lagonda Vignale, Concept, 2007 Aston Martin V12 Vantage RS, Concept, 2007 to 2008 Aston Martin V8 Vantage N400, 2009 Aston Martin Lagonda SUV, Concept. 2010 Aston Martin V12 Vantage Carbon Black Edition. 2010 Aston Martin DBS Carbon Black Edition. 2013 Aston Martin Rapide Biturn Jet 2+2, Concept.
Current models:
V8 Vantage Roadster and V12 Vantage, DB9 and DB9 Volante, Vanquish, Rapide, Aston Martin V12 Zagato, Aston Martin Virage.
Discontinued models:
2011 to 2013 Synod, based on the Toyota IQ. 2007 to 2012 Aston Martin DBS 512, 2009 to 2012 Aston Martin 177, 1977 to 1989 Aston Martin V8 Vantage, 1986 to 1990 Aston Martin V8 Zagato, 1989 to 1996 Aston Martin Virage Volante, 1989 to 2000 Aston Martin Virage, 1993 to 2000 Aston Martin Vantage, 1996 to 2000 Aston Martin V8 Coupe V8 Volante, 1993 to 2003 Aston Martin DB7/DB7 Vantage, 2001 to 2007 Aston Martin V12 Vanquish S, Aston Martin CC100 Speedster, Concept.
Motorsport: whole race cars post-war.
Aston Martin DB3, 1950 to 1953, Aston Martin DB3S, 1953 to 1956, Aston Martin DB01, 1956 to 1959, Aston Martin DB02, 1957 to 1958, Aston Martin DB03, 1958, Aston Martin DB04, 1959, Aston Martin DB05, 1960, Aston Martin DP212, 1962, Aston Martin DP214, 1963, Aston Martin DP215, 1963, Aston Martin RHAM/1, 1976 to 1979, Aston Martin AMR1, 1989, Aston Martin AMR2, never raced, Aston Martin DBR9, 2005, Aston Martin DBRS9, 2005, Aston Martin V8 Vantage N24, 2006, Aston Martin V8 Vantage Rally GT, 2006, Aston Martin V8 Vantage GT2, 2008, Aston Martin V8 Vantage GT4, 2008, Aston Martin DBR1-2, 2009, Aston Martin AMR1, 2011.
Engine supply only.
Cooper Aston Martin, 1963, Lola T70 Aston Martin, 1967, Aston Martin DPLM, 1980 to 1982, Nimrod NRAC2 Aston Martin, 1982 to 1984, Aston Martin EMKAC 83/1 and C84/1, 1983 to 1985, Cheetah G604 Aston Martin, Lola B08/60 Aston Martin, 2008.
Formula One World Championship results.
Key.
24 hours of Le Mans finishes. Sponsorships.
Aston Martin sponsors 2. Bundesliga Club 1860 Munich.